You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So, Glenn, Donald Trump and his team have now filed for a mistrial in the New York Attorney General's case, and that much we expected. But the filing is pretty much straight character assassination against Judge Engoron's clerk, and Trump was expressly forbidden from invoking that clerk according to the gag order. So, what impacts could this have?
It's almost like they're daring the judge to take more serious measures against Donald Trump and his lawyers. I mean, if they're not careful, Donald Trump is going to land in a jail cell as a sanction for, violating Judge Engoron's gag order in such dramatic fashion. So, as you say, Brian, this came in the context of the defense filing a mistrial motion. Now, that may sound dramatic. Oh, my goodness, a mistrial motion. Let me just tell you, as a former career prosecutor, I dealt with dozens and dozens of mistrial motions. Let me just give our viewers a little idea of the most routine mistrial motion that that prosecutors and that attorneys have to contend with. Let's assume I put a witness on the stand. That witness is testifying about the crimes of the defendant, and all of a sudden the witness blurts something out about the defendant committing a completely unrelated crime, a crime with which the defendant is not charged. I can promise you the defense attorney will jump up, say, Your Honor, objection, motion for a mistrial. And if the damage is severe enough, if the defendant's right to a fair trial has really been sort of irrevocably prejudiced, the judge might grant a mistrial motion. So mistrial motions are not that dramatic. They're pretty routine. They are often made and they are rarely granted. So the fact that Donald Trump's lawyers filed this mistrial motion is just not a big deal, particularly because there's no jury in the courtroom. Do you realize in order for Judge Engoron to grant this mistrial motion, Judge Engoron would have to conclude that he is hopelessly biased and prejudiced against Donald Trump, and that he has basically run roughshod over all of Donald Trump's rights as a litigant in this case. Needless to say, that's not going to happen. He's not going to rule that way because he hasn't been presiding that way. But Brian, coming back to your original point, Donald Trump has already been sanctioned twice for violating the judge's gag order by basically calling out the judge's clerk, thereby, as we all know, endangering the judge's clerk. So I think it was a shock to everybody when we saw in this mistrial motion the judge's clerk called out, the judge's clerk criticized up one side and down the other. And this is really unbelievable. They put a picture of the judge's clerk in the motion. I can't imagine why they would do that other than to so enrage Judge Engoron that maybe they could get him to say something or do something that was outrageous that they then might be able to add to their appeal. But, the only thing I can think of is if Judge Engoron said, listen, you go ahead and make the motion and I'm going to give you leeway to talk about my clerk. We know he had some private discussions with the parties. We don't know what those discussions involved, but I have a feeling tomorrow, now that this motion has been filed and it's in the public square, we're probably going to hear something from Judge Engoron about how he received this information and about whether this is yet another violation of the gag order.
Judge Engoron has been pretty fearless and relentless when it comes to slapping Donald Trump with sanctions to protect his court staff. He's done it pretty quickly. So what do you anticipate we'll see here when we do hear from Judge Engoron?
I would be surprised if he just imposed another money sanction, because he imposed two previously, and it obviously has not had the deterrent value that he had hoped. So, I'm just not ready to say a judge, particularly in a civil case, is prepared to impose a sanction that involves a former president of the United States cooling his heels in a jail cell for a while. But, it does seem like Donald Trump and his lawyers are really upping the ante and almost daring Judge Engoron to do something else. So, we'll see what happens.
Well, to that exact point, we do bring this up a lot, but I think it's important to keep beating this drum. When is there sufficient predicate to consider pretrial detention, considering, to your exact point, as long as there is breath in Donald Trump's body, he will never follow the rules laid out in a gag order?
In a civil case like the civil fraud trial that is underway in New York, rarely does anybody ever land in a jail cell. In a criminal case like in DC, and Florida and Georgia and New York in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, that's where you are far more likely to see pretrial detention as a sanction for violating a court order or a condition of release set by the judge. So I continue to think it's very unlikely in the setting of this civil case. However, I do think everything Donald Trump has been doing in this civil case will ultimately come back to haunt him in the criminal cases. We have already seen Jack Smith in some legal filings in the criminal cases reference what Donald Trump has been doing in the New York case, violating Judge Engoron's order in that civil case. So, all of this eventually is going to reach a boiling point and an aggregate, and we may very well see a Judge Chutkan decide that Donald Trump has sort of lost the opportunity to remain on release pending trial, and he may find himself cooling his heels in a jail cell in DC.
Well, on that exact point, can what he's doing here, even though it's a completely separate trial, can this serve as the warning for Donald Trump in the DC trial? If a judge is seeing that he's not following the conditions laid out in a gag order in this New York Attorney General trial, can this be like strike one and strike two in a separate trial?
It can be added to the mix when Judge Chutkan is deciding just how dangerous he has become and just how belligerent he is in his steadfast refusal to follow court orders. Ordinarily, Brian, let me tell you, though, how these things play out. Usually before a judge will revoke somebody on release or put them in jail pending trial for violating some sort of a condition of release or a gag order, the judge will put that person, that defendant, on specific notice. If you do it one more time, if you do what you did up in New York, I promise you the sanction will be a jail cell. Do you understand that, defendant Trump? Judges are usually loath to take that ultimate and most dramatic step unless they have put a defendant on direct notice of the consequences of continued misbehavior or another violation of a condition. So that feels like the direction that we're heading in.
All right, well, that seems like a good place to leave off. So obviously we'll stay on top of everything as Donald Trump continues to violate the conditions set forth in all of these different gag orders in the cases that he's contending with. Glenn, I should also note that this is episode 150 of the Legal Breakdown. So congrats on 150. And I'm sure, everybody watching right now is super grateful for all the information that you've given us. So with that said, I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching the Legal Breakdown.